The history of the Jewish presence in medieval Slovakia is tightly connected to their existence within the Upper Hungarian frontier, and was fundamentally rooted in the continuity of Roman commercial infrastructure. Following the expansion of the Roman Empire into the Pannonian provinces, the establishment of the limes, the fortified border along the Danube, created a permanent network of transit routes that linked the Mediterranean basin to the northern amber paths. Historical data confirms that Jewish merchants operated as itinerant traders within these military-civilian complexes, facilitating the exchange of luxury goods and textiles for local raw materials. The collapse of the Roman administration did not terminate these trade arteries. Rather, it left behind a skeletal network of riverine ports and mountain passes that the early Slavic and Avar populations utilized for regional commerce. By the 9th century, the Upper Hungarian territories, comprising much of modern-day Slovakia, functioned as a vital corridor for the Radhanite merchants, a sophisticated network of international Jewish traders who maintained the logistics of transcontinental exchange. These early residents were not yet sedentary subjects, but functioned as extraterritorial agents whose mobility was protected by their utility to local tribal elites. The transition to the Hungarian Principality further solidified this role as the early Arpad dynasty recognized the importance of maintaining the flow of silver and oriental commodities through the Danube Bend. Consequently, the Danubian threshold served as the structural foundation for the subsequent demographic integration of Jewish communities into the nascent medieval state. The presence of these merchants was documented by the 10th century traveler Ibrahim ibn Yaqub, who recorded the integration of Jewish traders into the Slavic markets of Central Europe, noting their role in the salt and slave trade. This early commercial activity was not governed by local ecclesiastical law, but by the pragmatic requirements of the Arpadian princes, who sought to stabilize the fiscal base of their emerging state. Archival evidence suggests that the earliest Jewish settlements were situated near the Gate of Hungary at Devin, where the confluence of the Morava and Danube rivers provided a natural bottleneck for customs collection. The administrative records of the period highlight the use of Jewish agents as negotores, or official merchant diplomats, who utilized their polyglot abilities to negotiate with the Byzantine and Germanic courts. The transition from mobile trade to fixed residency was catalyzed by the stabilization of the Hungarian-Austrian border, which encouraged the construction of the first permanent stone structures within the fortified castra of the northern counties. These initial urban footholds were characterized by their legal isolation. The residents were not members of the local gens, but were categorized as foreign specialists whose presence was essential for the circulation of bullion. By the 11th century, the Danubian threshold had evolved from a mere transit zone into a series of permanent logistical hubs, providing the royal treasury with its first reliable source of non-agrarian revenue. This structural integration ensured that the Jewish community was embedded in the kingdom's frontier defense and fiscal machinery, long before the formalization of medieval exclusionary statutes. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews, and did they actually deserve it? The consolidation of the Hungarian kingdom under the early Arpadian monarchs necessitated the creation of specific legal instruments to manage the diverse ethnic and religious populations of the frontier. Unlike the decentralized feudal systems of Western Europe, the early Hungarian state was characterized by a patrimonial monarchy where the king exercised absolute ownership over the land and its non-Christian inhabitants. This relationship was formalized through royal decrees that bypassed the traditional tribal laws, placing Jewish families under the direct protection of the crown. The monarchs utilized these populations as essential agents for the fiscal administration of the royal domains, granting them specific exemptions from the local custom of the land in exchange for their role in managing the king's salt and silver monopolies. This legal status established a binary relationship. The Jewish resident was a guest of the monarch, whose rights were not inherent but were derived from a sovereign grant. The early Arpadian King's Peace served as a deterrent against local violence, as an injury to a Jewish merchant was legally defined as a violation of the king's own person. This period was marked by the professionalization of the royal chancery, which began to record the presence of Jewish communities in administrative centers like Nitra and Bratislava. By providing a stable, albeit conditional, legal environment, the Arpadian legacy created the necessary conditions for the transition from transient trade to permanent urban settlement. The specific legal mechanisms of this era were defined by the Iura Regalia, or royal prerogatives, which identified Jewish settlers as property of the treasury, a status that shielded them from the judicial authority of the local nobility and the emerging municipal councils. This jurisdictional insulation was critical in the Slovakian counties, where the high concentration of royal estates and mining assets required a workforce that was loyal exclusively to the crown. Royal emissaries, known as comes, were tasked with collecting taxes from these communities, ensuring that the revenue bypassed the provincial intermediaries and flowed directly into the central fiscus. The legal code of King Ladislaus IV in the late 11th century provided the first formal regulations concerning interconfessional interactions, focusing primarily on the preservation of the royal monopoly over Jewish labor and capital. These laws prohibited the local Christian elite from enslaving or taxing Jewish subjects without explicit royal consent, thereby maintaining the community as a specialized fiscal reserve. Furthermore, the early Hungarian kings issued individual letters of protection, or literae passus, which permitted Jewish traders to move between the royal castles of the north without being subject to the arbitrary tolls of the rural barony. This administrative architecture transformed the Jewish population into a cohesive, state-monitored group whose legal existence was inextricably linked to the physical and political survival of the Arpad line. The Arpadian legacy thus established a precedent of centralized monarchical control that functioned as the primary safeguard for the community against the rising tide of ecclesiastical and feudal opposition. The year 1222 marked a definitive legislative rupture in the Hungarian constitutional tradition with the promulgation of the Golden Bull by King Andrew II. This foundational document was not an act of royal benevolence, but a forced concession to the serviens regius, the emerging class of lesser nobility, and the ecclesiastical hierarchy who sought to curb the expansive fiscal autonomy of the crown. A critical focus of this document was the systematic restriction of the king's ability to utilize non-Christian experts in the management of the state's financial apparatus. Article 24 of the Golden Bull explicitly prohibited the appointment of Jews or Muslims to offices involving the administration of royal revenues, the stewardship of salt monopolies, or the oversight of the mints. This clause represented the first formalized attempt to dismantle the Arpadian tradition of non-feudal financial management, framing the exclusion not in purely theological terms, but as a defense of the liberties of the realm. The nobility argued that the presence of infidel officials in the highest tiers of the treasury created a structural imbalance that favored royal centralism over traditional feudal rights. The enforcement of the Golden Bull introduced a period of intense administrative friction as the Crown's perpetual need for liquid capital directly conflicted with these new statutory barriers. Although the king frequently utilized dispensations to retain skilled Jewish financiers in key logistical roles, the 1222 decree provided the Church with the legal leverage to demand the immediate removal of non-Christian agents from the royal chancery. The Fourth Lateran Council's influence was visible in the subsequent reconfirmations of the bull, which added provisions requiring Jewish residents to wear distinct clothing to prevent spiritual contamination during fiscal transactions. In the Slovakian counties, this legislative shift was felt in the municipal administration of towns like Nitra, where local Christian elites utilized the Golden Bull to challenge the validity of Jewish-held tax farming contracts. The document established the concept of unsuitability for office based on confession, effectively mutating a professional fiscal role into a subject of intense political and religious debate. By mid-13th century, the Golden Bull had succeeded in creating a legal environment where the monarch's protective power was no longer absolute, but was increasingly checked by the documented demands of the noble estates. This period thus marked the transition from the unchallenged royal patronage of the 11th century to a more volatile system of negotiated presence, where the legal standing of the Jewish community became a recurring point of contention in the struggle between the crown and the nobility. The structural stability of the Hungarian state was fundamentally dismantled in 1241 by the Mongol invasion, a military catastrophe that resulted in the near-total liquidation of the kingdom's urban and agricultural infrastructure. Following the defeat of the royal army at the Battle of Mohi, the Trans-Danubian and Upper Hungarian territories were subjected to a systematic campaign of destruction that targeted the existing centers of royal administration and ecclesiastical authority. Archaeological and archival data from the northern counties indicate a population loss of 30 to 50% in the lowlands, creating a profound demographic vacuum that threatened the viability of the state's fiscal system. This period of total societal rupture terminated the previous organic growth of the frontier markets, as the itinerant trade networks were severed by the collapse of security and the flight of the surviving urban elites. The destruction of the royal chanceries and the loss of land registers in cities like Nitra and Bratislava left the crown without the bureaucratic means to collect traditional feudal dues, forcing a radical re-evaluation of the kingdom's economic foundations. King Bela IV, returning from exile to a decimated realm, recognized that the survival of the Arpad dynasty depended on the rapid reconstruction of the royal free cities and the restoration of the state's liquid reserves. To address the catastrophic shortage of skilled labor and capital, the monarch launched a state-sponsored program of Second Foundation, which prioritized the recruitment of foreign experts, merchants, and financiers. In a decisive legislative shift, the Crown issued an official invitation to Jewish families from the neighboring Austrian and Germanic territories, particularly from the highly organized communities of the Danube Valley. These migrants were viewed not merely as residents but as essential instruments of national recovery, possessing the liquid capital and international connections necessary to rebuild the ruined mining and commercial hubs. The king provided these settlers with generous land grants and permanent stone dwellings in strategic urban centers, effectively bypassing the traditional guild restrictions that would have otherwise impeded their integration. This policy was motivated by a cold, pragmatic assessment. The Crown required an immediate influx of bullion and the professional management of the royal monopolies to fund the construction of a new, stone-fortified defensive network. The invitation led to a structured, large-scale migration that transformed the social composition of Upper Hungarian towns like Trnava and Bratislava. The Crown utilized the privilegium system to grant these newcomers a unique legal status that protected their commercial operations from the interference of the impoverished local nobility. By 1244, the royal administration had begun to formalize the role of these financiers in the Burgregel, or the royal mining prerogatives, entrusting them with the capital investment required to reopen the silver and gold mines of the Slovakian highlands. This era marked the transition from a purely agrarian economy to one dependent on state-monitored credit and international bullion trade. The royal invitation was not an act of tolerance, but a targeted administrative strategy designed to fill the vacuum left by the Mongol withdrawal with a loyal, taxable, and highly skilled class of financial agents. This professionalization of the reconstruction effort ensured that the royal treasury could once again sustain the high costs of permanent military mobilization and centralized government. The Mongol rupture thus served as the catalyst for the definitive urban concentration of Jewish communities in Slovakia, creating the modern sedentary framework of the royal chamber's financial apparatus. The institutionalization of Jewish legal standing in the medieval Hungarian state reached its definitive form through the doctrine of servi camerai, or chamber servants. This juridical category derived from Holy Roman imperial precedents, but adapted to the specific needs of the Arpadian and later Anjou monarchs, established the community as the direct, exclusive property of the royal treasury. Unlike the Christian subjects who occupied various rungs of the feudal hierarchy, the chamber servants were situated entirely outside the traditional social contract, maintaining a relationship that was purely vertical and strictly administrative. This status defined the Jewish population as a fiscal extension of the monarch's person, rendering their wealth, their bodies, and their residences subject to the absolute prerogative of the royal chamber. The legal fiction of servitude was not an expression of domestic slavery, but a specialized form of state-monitored alienage that granted the crown a monopoly over their financial utility. In the Slovakian counties, where the centralization of mining and trade was paramount, the servi camerai designation allowed the king to bypass the provincial judiciary and municipal councils, ensuring that all litigation involving Jewish agents was adjudicated solely by royal commissioners. This legal framework functioned as a sophisticated mechanism for state-sanctioned extraction, transforming the Jewish community into a liquid financial reservoir for the monarch's persistent budgetary needs. The king exercised the right to levy tallages, arbitrary and comprehensive taxes, whenever the state faced military expenditures or diplomatic obligations that exceeded ordinary feudal revenues. Because the community was defined as royal property, the crown could legally seize outstanding loan bonds or liquidate private assets without the procedural delays required by common law. This fiscal instrument was managed by the tavernicus, or the royal treasurer, who maintained a census of the Jewish households to maximize the efficiency of collection. In exchange for this intense economic exploitation, the servi camerae were granted a high degree of physical security and the right to engage in professions such as high-interest lending and bullion exchange that were barred to Christian subjects under canon law prohibitions against usury. This trade-off ensured that the community remained a highly productive, albeit politically impotent, asset of the state. The administrative consequence of this status was the creation of a legal island within the urban fabric of the royal free cities. The crown mandated that Jewish residents were accountable to no authority other than the royal chancellery, a privilege that frequently generated intense friction with the local municipal guilds and the clergy. While the servi camerae were shielded from the arbitrary imposts of the nobility, they remained in a state of perpetual precariousness, as their existence was entirely contingent upon their continued perceived utility to the treasury. The legal records of the late 13th and early 14th centuries indicate that the crown utilized this status to weaponize the Jewish community against the fiscal decentralization favored by the aristocratic estates. By centralizing the management of Jewish capital, the monarchs secured a reliable source of funding that was independent of parliamentary grants or noble consent. However, this same institutional link ensured that any political movement against royal centralism was inherently directed at the king's chamber servants, making them the primary targets of social and legislative hostility. The servi camerae doctrine thus perfected the community's role as the indispensable yet ultimately disposable financial instrument of the medieval Hungarian crown. The promulgation of the Royal Charter of 1251 by King Bela IV constituted the final formal synthesis of the Hungarian state's judicial policy toward its Jewish population. This document, issued from the royal chancery in the wake of the post-Mongol reconstruction, was designed to provide a comprehensive, standardized legal environment that addressed the specific requirements of a settled urban demographic. The charter was not merely a list of privileges, but a rigorous administrative code consisting of 31 specific clauses that regulated the interactions between the king's subjects and the wider Christian society. Its primary objective was to secure the functional stability of the royal financial agents by granting them a degree of internal self-governance and judicial autonomy unprecedented in the upper Hungarian frontier. Under the provisions of this mandate, Jewish residents were legally exempted from the jurisdiction of municipal magistrates and local ecclesiastical courts, ensuring that all civil and criminal disputes were reserved for the direct arbitration of the monarch or his designated Jewish judge. This official, a high-ranking royal administrator, was tasked with enforcing the charter's protections and ensuring that the community's fiscal utility was not undermined by localized prejudice or procedural delays. A significant portion of the 1251 legislation was dedicated to the physical and spiritual integrity of the community's institutional infrastructure. The charter explicitly forbade any form of encroachment upon synagogues, ritual baths, or educational centers, defining the desecration of these sites as a capital offense against the Crown. This legal protection extended to the houses of the dead, mandating that Jewish cemeteries be treated as inviolable royal property. Such measures were essential for the maintenance of communal continuity in towns like Bratislava and Trnava, where the construction of permanent stone religious buildings symbolized the transition from transient residency to deep-rooted urban integration. Furthermore, the charter addressed the security of Jewish households, prohibiting the quartering of troops or the seizure of private property without a direct warrant from the king's treasurer. These safeguards were intended to prevent the spontaneous expropriations that often accompanied periods of high military mobilization in the northern counties. By codifying these protections, the 1251 decree transformed the Jewish quarter from a temporary enclave into a legally recognized, state-protected entity. The charter also formalized the evidentiary standards required for interconfessional litigation, introducing a system of mixed testimony to ensure judicial fairness. In any legal dispute between a Christian and a Jew, the 1251 Code required that witnesses from both communities be present to validate the claims, a requirement that bypassed the inherent bias of the traditional ordeal or singular oath-taking. This procedural innovation was particularly critical in matters of financial contracts and property deeds, providing a layer of verifiable documentation that underpinned the kingdom's emerging credit economy. Additionally, the charter granted Jewish residents the right to engage in wholesale trade and the transit of commodities across all internal borders without being subject to the arbitrary tolls of the rural nobility. This freedom of movement was fundamental to the Crown's strategy of maximizing the circulation of bullion and the collection of royal customs. The 1251 Charter thus functioned as the definitive Bill of Rights for the community, providing a stable, documented foundation that would remain the primary legal reference for Jewish life in the Slovakian districts until the radical shifts of the late 14th century. This era of legislative clarity ensured that the community functioned as a cohesive, protected fiscal unit, securely integrated into the administrative machinery of the Arpadian state. The economic geography of the Upper Hungarian territories was anchored by the royal mining towns, a network of strategically significant centers in the central Slovakian ore mountains, including Kremnica, Banska Štiavnica, and Banska Bystrica. The strategic settlement of Jewish families in these highland districts was directly linked to the expansion of the Burgregal, the royal prerogative over all mineral resources. Unlike the agrarian feudal estates, these towns functioned as specialized industrial zones under the direct jurisdiction of the royal chamber, requiring a sophisticated administrative and financial infrastructure to manage the extraction of silver, gold, and copper. Historical ledger data from the 14th century indicates that Jewish residents were primarily integrated into the upper tiers of the mining administration, serving as official assayers, bullion brokers, and logistical managers for the royal mints. Their role was essential for the transition from surface-level extraction to complex, deep-shaft mining, which demanded significant capital investment and a high degree of technical oversight that the local mining guilds were often unable to provide independently. The presence of Jewish financiers in these centers was governed by the urbura, the royal mining tax, which required a precise accounting of all refined metal before it could be legally circulated. Jewish officials were tasked with the procurement of mercury and other materials necessary for the smelting process, as well as the management of the supply lines that provided the mining camps with grain and industrial tools from the lowlands. This integration into the core of the kingdom's metallurgical sector granted the community a unique level of economic influence, as the stability of the Hungarian currency, the florin, depended on the consistent output of the Kremnica mint. However, this proximity to the crown's most valuable assets also intensified the socio-economic friction with the Waldburger, the established class of German mining entrepreneurs and forest owners, who viewed the Jewish administrators as competitors for royal favor and local monopolies. The state utilized this tension to maintain a system of checks and balances, ensuring that no single urban estate could achieve total control over the mining revenues. Furthermore, the royal mining towns served as centers for the refined metal trade, where Jewish merchants facilitated the export of Hungarian copper and silver to the markets of the Venetian Republic and the Hanseatic League. This international commercial network provided the crown with essential foreign exchange and access to specialized technical knowledge regarding advanced drainage systems and ventilation for the mines. The administrative records of the period show that the Jewish community in Banska Štiavnica was granted specific land titles for the construction of stone warehouses and refining facilities, reinforcing their status as permanent, indispensable agents of the royal industrial policy. The concentration of these families in the Ore Mountains was therefore a deliberate act of state building, intended to maximize the fiscal yield of the northern frontier while consolidating monarchical authority over the kingdom's primary source of wealth. This era of industrial participation solidified the community's role as the technical and financial backbone of the Anjou state, anchoring their legal and social existence to the physical output of the Slovakian mines. The development of the medieval urban landscape in the Slovakian counties was characterized by the deliberate spatial organization of Jewish residency into governmentally sanctioned districts, a process driven by the administrative requirements of the royal treasury. These enclaves were not the result of organic population growth, but were strategically positioned according to the logistical needs of the Crown's fiscal monitoring system. In cities such as Bratislava, Trnava, and Nitra, the Jewish street was consistently located in high-visibility zones adjacent to the municipal fortifications and the royal castrum or governor's residence. This proximity served a dual purpose. It ensured the immediate physical protection of the monarch's financial agents during periods of civil instability and allowed royal officials to maintain constant oversight of the community's liquid assets. The spatial boundary between the Jewish quarter and the surrounding Christian artisan districts was often demarcated by gates and chains, effectively creating a jurisdictional island where the royal prerogative superseded municipal law. The architecture within these enclaves reflected the specialized economic functions of the residents and the high value of the capital they managed. While the general medieval populace relied primarily on structures of timber and wattle and daub, the wealthiest Jewish families invested in the construction of domus lapidae, or formidable stone houses. These buildings were engineered for security, featuring thick walls and deep fireproof vaults designed to safeguard bullion, precious metal collateral, and the parchment records of the Arca system. The physical durability of these structures distinguished the Jewish quarter from the more vulnerable timber-built quarters of the Christian burghers, symbolizing a permanent but distinct economic presence within the urban fabric. Central to the functionality of the enclave was the schola, or synagogue, which operated as a multi-purpose institutional hub for religious observance, judicial proceedings of the Kahal, and the storage of communal archives. The maintenance of ritual infrastructure, such as the mikveh, or ritual bath, required sophisticated water management systems that were often integrated into the city's defensive drainage networks. The spatial configuration of the ghetto also facilitated the monopoly of documentation required by the royal chamber. Every debt contract and commercial agreement was legally required to be finalized and stored within the official repositories located inside the enclave. This centralization of financial data made the community entirely transparent to the king's auditors, who could assess the total body of indebtedness with administrative precision. The gates of the Jewish quarter were typically guarded by royal appointees, ensuring that the movement of persons and commodities could be recorded for tax purposes. This architectural and spatial isolation was a foundational component of state building, as it transformed a mobile commercial class into a stationary, quantifiable, and easily accessible fiscal unit. The architecture of the ghetto therefore functioned as a physical manifestation of the servi camera status, where the built environment served the interests of the sovereign by concentrating wealth into a controlled and defensible zone. By the mid-14th century, these stone-built enclaves had become permanent fixtures of the Slovakian royal free cities, anchoring the community's social and legal existence to the very walls that both protected and confined them. Bratislava, designated as Pressburg in German and Pozsony in Hungarian, functioned as the primary western gateway of the kingdom, and its Jewish topography was intrinsically linked to its role as a strategic transit hub. The specific layout of the Judengasse, or Jewish Street, was defined by its location in the western suburb, situated on the direct path between the royal castle and the primary riverine crossing of the Danube. This placement was an administrative necessity, as it allowed for the systematic monitoring of the high-volume trade moving towards Vienna and the Austrian markets. Unlike the enclaves in the mining districts, the Bratislava Jewry was characterized by its concentration near the Vidrika Gate, a site that anchored the town's defensive perimeter while maintaining accessibility to the central marketplace. The street was meticulously integrated into the city's fortification plan, with the Castle Hill providing an immediate military oversight that deterred localized civic unrest while ensuring the Crown's direct access to the resident financiers. The administrative significance of this specific layout was manifested in the proximity of the Jewish quarters to the seat of the Tavernicus, the royal treasurer, who frequently resided within the castle complex. This physical closeness facilitated the rapid execution of fiscal mandates, as the king's officials could summon the community's leadership for immediate assessments or the negotiation of large-scale state loans. Archival records from the 14th century highlight the existence of a specialized royal appointeries, the Judex Judiorum, or Jewish count, who acted as a permanent liaison between the community and the royal chancery. This official's residence was strategically positioned at the interface of the Jewish street and the Christian municipal core, serving as a jurisdictional buffer that protected royal interests from the encroachments of the Bratislava City Council. The community's infrastructure in the capital, including the central synagogue and the ritual bath, was subject to periodic inspections by royal revisers to ensure that the communal properties were properly maintained as state-sanctioned assets. Furthermore, the Bratislava enclave functioned as the kingdom's definitive archive for international financial instruments. The proximity to the royal mints and the customs house allowed the community to specialize in the valuation of foreign currencies and the management of cross-border bills of exchange. The street's morphology, with its narrow alleyways and reinforced stone dwellings, provided a defensible space for the storage of the royal debt registers, which documented the liabilities of the high nobility of the western counties. This concentration of institutional power made the Bratislava Jewry the most visible and politically sensitive segment of the Crown's financial apparatus. The specific topography of the Judengasse thus served as a physical manifestation of the Anjou dynasty's centralization policy, where the community's residency was utilized as a tool for the monarch's direct control over the kingdom's most vital commercial artery. By the middle of the 14th century, the Jewish street of Bratislava had evolved into a sophisticated administrative precinct, its very geography ensuring that the community was perpetually within the sovereign's reach. The professionalization of the Hungarian monetary system during the 14th century was predicated on the technical and metallurgical expertise of Jewish experts designated as Comes Camera, or Counts of the Chamber, who managed the royal mints. Under the fiscal reforms initiated by Charles Robert and expanded by Louis XIV, the Crown sought to consolidate its authority over the striking of currency to eliminate the proliferation of debased regional coins. Jewish specialists were essential to this transition, as they possessed the forensic knowledge required to maintain consistent alloy standards and weight specifications across the kingdom's dispersed minting centers, most notably in Kremnica and Smolnik. These individuals operated as state-sanctioned contractors who leased the minting rights from the royal treasury, assuming the logistical burden of procuring raw gold and silver from the mining districts and converting it into the florinus aureus, the gold florin, and the silver denarius. The introduction of the gold florin in 1325, modeled on the Florentine standard, required a precision in refining and engraving that was predominantly managed by these Jewish masters of the mint, whose command of international exchange rates and metal purity ensured the currency's viability in the trans-European markets. The administrative framework governing the mints was defined by the principle of moneta perpetua, or permanent currency, which aimed to provide a stable medium of exchange that did not require the frequent forced devaluations characteristic of earlier reigns. Jewish mint masters were responsible for the rigorous enforcement of the right of the hammer, ensuring that every coin struck bore the royal seal and met the exact fineness mandated by the Anjou Chancellery. This oversight was critical for the crown's fiscal integrity, as the revenue derived from seigniorage, the profit generated from the difference between the face value of the coin and its production cost, constituted a primary pillar of the royal budget. The state utilized the expertise of these financiers to implement a system of compulsory exchange, where foreign merchants were required to trade their bullion for local currency at state-monitored rates, a process that effectively trapped precious metals within the Hungarian borders. The technical superiority of the Jewish minting staff allowed the crown to produce a currency that was resistant to counterfeiting, or falsarii, thereby protecting the royal treasury from the economic disruption caused by illicit mints operated by the provincial nobility. However, the visibility of Jewish experts in the management of the kingdom's coinage also exposed them to the political fallout of the crown's monetary policies. The administration of the lucrum camera, or the chamber's profit, involved the collection of taxes associated with the periodic reissuance of coins, a procedure that was frequently perceived as a predatory fiscal maneuver by the artisan and agrarian classes. Because Jewish officials were the immediate executors of these devaluations and currency exchanges, they became the public face of the monarch's fiscal reach. The documentation from the royal archives indicates that the crown frequently utilized these mint masters as scapegoats during periods of economic instability, diverting popular frustration away from the sovereign's budgetary requirements. This structural role in the monetary system ensured that the Jewish community was perpetually at the center of the kingdom's fiscal apparatus, their technical necessity providing them with high-level court access while simultaneously cementing their status as the primary targets of social and economic resentment. By the late 14th century, the masters of the mint had perfected the kingdom's monetary machinery, but their close association with the crown's financial manipulation made their position increasingly untenable as the Anjou state moved toward total religious and administrative homogeneity. The fiscal infrastructure of the Upper Hungarian highlands was fundamentally dependent on the arenda system, a sophisticated mechanism of tax farming that delegated the collection of royal revenues to private contractors. Under the Anjou state, the crown sought to convert its vast euro regalia, royal monopolies over essential commodities, into immediate, predictable liquidity to sustain the high costs of a centralized military. The most critical of these monopolies was the Salis Camera, or the salt chamber, which controlled the extraction, distribution, and sale of salt, a resource as vital as precious metals for the medieval economy. Because the crown lacked the bureaucratic depth to manage the granular logistics of salt distribution across the northern counties, it utilized the arenda to lease the management of these salt offices to Jewish financiers. These arrendators provided the royal treasury with substantial upfront payments in exchange for the right to collect duties and manage the white gold warehouses in centers like Prešov and Solivar. This arrangement provided the monarch with the instantaneous capital required for diplomatic subsidies and the maintenance of the royal retinue, effectively outsourcing the fiscal risk of commodity price fluctuations to the Jewish community. The reach of the arenda extended beyond salt, encompassing the leasing of the Vini Otcup, the exclusive right to produce and sell alcohol, as well as the management of royal mills, forest products, and internal customs checkpoints known as the Tricesima. By securing these leases, Jewish agents became the primary intermediaries between the Crown's fiscal requirements and the daily economic life of the highland peasantry and urban artisans. This position created a vital structural link. The royal fiscus was fueled by the administrative efficiency of the Jewish lessees, whose mastery of ledger-keeping and regional credit ensured that no portion of the royal monopoly was lost to local evasion. However, this fiscal integration was inherently precarious. As the visible face of royal extraction, the arrendator became the focal point for the socio-economic grievances of the local estates. The nobility and the burghers viewed the leasing of state assets not as a pragmatic administrative tool, but as an illegitimate alienation of the kingdom's resources to alien elements. This perceived exclusion from the profitable management of the regalia fueled a coordinated political movement to terminate these lease agreements, framing the arenda as a threat to the traditional rights of the Christian estates. The documentation from the royal chamber in the mid-14th century reveals that while the arenda generated nearly one-third of the kingdom's non-agrarian revenue, it simultaneously eroded the social stability of the frontier. The Jewish lessees operated in a state of constant legal tension, where their contracts were subject to arbitrary cancellation by the monarch if political pressure from the nobility became too great. Furthermore, the state utilized the arenda to deflect responsibility for high prices and aggressive tax collection away from the crown. When local unrest erupted over salt prices or liquor duties, the royal chancellery frequently portrayed the Jewish leaseholders as predatory actors rather than as agents of the sovereign's own budgetary policy. This systemic precarity ensured that the financial power derived from the arenda was never translated into political security. Instead, the financial power created by the leasing system deepened the community's dependency on the personal protection of the king, even as the king himself prepared to sacrifice these fiscal links to achieve total administrative and religious homogeneity within his dual kingdoms. By 1380, the arenda had perfected the extraction of wealth from the highlands, but it had also turned the community into a fiscal target that the crown would soon find politically necessary to eliminate. The internal stability of the Jewish communities in the Slovakian royal cities was preserved through the sophisticated administrative framework of the Kahal, a semi-autonomous governing council that functioned as the primary intermediary between the individual resident and the Hungarian crown. This institutional structure was recognized by the royal chancery as a necessary organ for the efficient management of the servi camerae, as it decentralized the burden of tax assessment, civil adjudication, and social welfare. The Kahal was led by a board of elders known as parnasim, who were typically drawn from the mercantile and financial elite. These officials were held legally accountable by the royal treasurer for the total fiscal output of the community, exercising the power to levy internal assessments on individual households to meet the Crown's arbitrary tallages. This system of collective responsibility ensured that the royal chamber received its mandated revenues without the need for a granular state bureaucracy to monitor thousands of private transactions. The administrative records of the Kahal, meticulously maintained in communal registers known as Pinkasim, provided the state with a verifiable census and a detailed ledger of the community's collective assets, effectively functioning as a localized extension of the royal fiscal apparatus. Central to the Kahal's authority was the maintenance of a distinct judicial system, the Beth Din, which exercised exclusive jurisdiction over civil and religious disputes between Jewish litigants. These rabbinical courts operated according to the principles of halachic law, providing a consistent and predictable legal environment that was entirely independent of the feudal manorial courts or the municipal magistrates. The Beth Din adjudicated matters of inheritance, marriage contracts, and commercial partnerships, utilizing a body of precedent that was synchronized with the requirements of international trade and credit. The Crown sanctioned this judicial independence because it prevented the cluttering of the royal courts with complex theological or ritual disputes, while ensuring that commercial litigation was resolved by experts in liquid capital management. The rabbinical judges, or dayanim, were required to ensure that their rulings did not conflict with the jura regalia of the monarch, creating a hybrid legal culture where internal religious statutes were adapted to serve the broader interests of the Anjou state. This judicial autonomy was essential for preserving the community's social cohesion, as it prevented the erosion of traditional norms by external municipal influences. The efficacy of the Kahal's administrative and judicial functions was underpinned by a robust pedagogical infrastructure that ensured near universal literacy among the male population. This commitment to education was manifested in the network of cheaters and yeshivot, funded by communal tithes, which provided rigorous training in Hebrew, Aramaic, and the logic of the Babylonian Talmud. In the Slovakian urban centers, this educational system produced a class of professionals who possessed a facility with documentation and complex accounting that far exceeded the literacy levels of the surrounding artisan and agrarian classes. This intellectual capital was a primary driver of the community's economic utility, as it allowed Jewish agents to manage the intricate ledger-keeping required for the arenda system and the royal mints. The state recognized that the community's value to the treasury was inextricably linked to its internal educational cycle, which produced the scribes and financial auditors necessary for the kingdom's fiscal centralization. However, this high level of cultural and legal isolation also reinforced the community's status as a distinct state within a state, making its autonomous structures a primary target for 14th century reformers who sought to dissolve all regional and confessional barriers in favor of a singular Catholic administrative uniformity. The death of Charles Robert in 1342 and the subsequent coronation of Louis XIII signaled the initiation of a fundamental reorientation in the ideological and constitutional architecture of the Hungarian state. Unlike the preceding era of pragmatic fiscal consolidation, the new reign was defined by a transition toward a more pervasive form of Anjou absolutism, characterized by the rigorous standardization of the royal chancery and the formal integration of Catholic orthodoxy into the machinery of civil administration. Louis XIII, deeply influenced by the sophisticated court traditions of Naples, sought to establish the monarch as the supreme moral and spiritual guardian of the realm, a vision that necessitated the creation of a unified, religiously homogeneous body politic. This period saw the professionalization of the royal council, where high ecclesiastical figures attained unprecedented authority over the formulation of imperial policy, ensuring that secular law increasingly reflected the requirements of canon law. The shift toward a religiously oriented monarchy led to the systematic marginalization of the Jewish financial agents who had previously functioned as the primary intermediaries of the crown's fiscal operations. The royal administration increasingly prioritized the development of a domestic Christian merchant class, granting municipal guilds in the Slovakian royal free cities protectionist charters that were designed to supersede the existing Jewish commercial monopolies. Louis XIV implemented the honor system with increased rigidity, appointing castellans and voivodes whose political and theological alignment with the crown ensured the suppression of local multi-confessional arrangements in the northern counties. This centralization effort was supported by the expansion of the royal treasury's oversight, which moved from the flexible management of chamber servants to a system of standardized taxation that favored the newly empowered Christian urban estates. The adoption of ius commune principles by the royal chancellery provided the legal instruments necessary to dissolve the jurisdictional autonomy previously granted to non-Christian residents, making them subject to the increasingly restrictive statutes of the centralized state. By mid-14th century, the crown no longer viewed its Jewish subjects as a permanent fiscal asset, but as a spiritual outlier that obstructed the fulfillment of the king's vision of a holy Hungarian kingdom. This administrative reordering resulted in the gradual withdrawal of the personal royal protections that had defined the Arpadian legacy, replacing them with a state-mandated program of social and religious containment. The king's frequent absences for military campaigns in Italy and the Balkans further decentralized the immediate execution of justice, allowing local municipal councils to enforce anti-Jewish measures with minimal interference from the central court. Consequently, the accession of Louis the Great established the structural and ideological preconditions for the eventual mass displacement. As the state transitioned from a transactional protectorate to a sovereignty defined by confessional purity, the professionalization of the bureaucracy and the consolidation of ecclesiastical power ensured that by 1380 the legal and social framework that had permitted Jewish life in Slovakia had been thoroughly eroded by the Anjou program of national and religious uniformity. This era of centralization transformed the western frontier into a zone of targeted administrative exclusion, where the presence of the Jewish community was no longer seen as a fiscal necessity, but as a violation of the king's sacred mission. The administrative evolution of the Hungarian state under Louis XIII was significantly shaped by the Italian influence, a process driven by the importation of sophisticated legal and bureaucratic theories from the Angevin court of Naples. As a member of the Neapolitan branch of the Anjou dynasty, Louis I maintained a continuous exchange of personnel and ideas with the Mediterranean South, leading to the arrival of Italian jurists and advisors trained in the resurrected traditions of Roman civil law. These professionals, often graduates of the University of Naples, introduced the doctrine of Rex Imperator in Regno Suo. The king is emperor in his own kingdom, which provided the theoretical framework for a totalizing monarchical sovereignty. This legal philosophy advocated for the dismantling of localized, pluralistic legal structures in favor of a centralized ius commune, where the king's will was the primary source of legislative and judicial authority. In the Slovakian counties, this meant a systematic effort to override the varied regional customs that had previously permitted specialized legal niches for non-Christian residents. The Neapolitan model emphasized the creation of an absolute uniformity of the king's subjects, a concept that fundamentally clashed with the existing medieval tradition of corporate privileges and group-based legal statuses. These Italian-trained bureaucrats viewed the specialized jurisdictional autonomy of the Jewish Kahal and the Beth Din as an administrative anomaly that obstructed the efficient operation of a unified state. Under this influence, the royal chancery began to utilize the general regulation as a tool for social engineering, seeking to standardize the obligations and rights of all urban residents regardless of confession. This drive for homogeneity was not merely a theological goal, but a logistical one. The state required a streamlined citizenry that could be monitored and taxed through a single, professionalized department of the Treasury. The administrative logic of the Neapolitan advisors held that a kingdom's strength was derived from the total religious and legal alignment of its inhabitants with the person of the monarch. The professionalization of the Hungarian bureaucracy using these Italian methods resulted in the introduction of more rigorous documentation and accounting practices. The royal chancellery adopted the Neapolitan system of secretariat oversight, where centralized records were used to cross-reference municipal activities with the king's decrees. This increased transparency allowed the state to identify and eliminate the various exceptional statuses that had historically exempted Jewish financiers from certain municipal burdens. Furthermore, the Neapolitan influence brought a new emphasis on the purity of the public square, a doctrine that advocated for the removal of non-Christian symbols and practices from the urban landscape to reinforce the Catholic character of the state. This policy was supported by the arrival of Italian mendicant reformers who provided the ideological justification for the suppression of foreign religious life. By the 1360s, the Neapolitan administrative theories had successfully redefined the Hungarian subject as a component of a religiously uniform whole, leaving no legal space for the continued existence of the specialized extraterritorial chamber servants. The Italian influence thus provided the intellectual and bureaucratic machinery required to transform the king's personal protection into a program of national and religious exclusion. The rise of urban corporatism in the mid-14th century introduced a new layer of systemic friction into the economic landscape of Upper Hungary, primarily through the professionalization of the Christian merchant and artisan guilds. These corporate entities, known as Gilda or Zunft, were established under municipal charters to regulate the quality, price, and volume of production within the royal free cities. By the reign of Louis I, these guilds had transitioned from simple fraternal organizations into powerful political estates that exercised significant control over the municipal councils of towns such as Bratislava, Košice, and Prešov. The primary objective of these guilds was the enforcement of protectionist statutes designed to eliminate any commercial activity that operated outside their internal regulatory frameworks. This put them in direct terminal conflict with the Jewish merchant class, whose commercial rights were derived from personal royal licenses rather than municipal guild membership. The burghers argued that the Jewish community's ability to conduct trade without adhering to guild-mandated pricing or apprenticeship cycles constituted a form of unregulated and therefore illegitimate competition. The judicial weaponization of the jus stapulae, or staple right, became a primary tool for the guilds to obstruct the trans-European trade networks managed by Jewish financiers. This legal privilege required all foreign merchants passing through a city to offer their goods for sale to local burghers for a specified period, typically 3 days, at state-regulated prices. While Jewish merchants had historically been exempted from these local constraints by royal decree, the urban councils under Louis I began to enforce these regulations with increasing rigidity. The guilds petitioned the royal chancery to categorize Jewish residents as foreigners or guests, hospits, under the Gastrecht, effectively stripping them of the commercial immunities they had enjoyed since the Arpadian era. Burnham, forcing Jewish traders to comply with the staple rights of the cities, the guilds sought to capture the liquid capital and luxury commodities that had previously bypassed the municipal markets. This administrative pressure aimed to transform the royal free cities into closed economic zones where the only permissible commercial actors were those sworn to the municipal statutes. The conflict was further exacerbated by the guild's demand for the mile right, a territorial monopoly that prohibited any non-guild member from engaging in retail trade within a specified radius of the city walls. In the Slovakian mining districts and the Danubian commercial hubs, this policy targeted the rural trade networks where Jewish agents functioned as the primary intermediaries between the highland producers and the international markets. The guilds successfully lobbied for the implementation of the law of the Third Estate, which prioritized the economic stability of the Christian burgher class as a prerequisite for internal peace. Louis XIII, requiring the logistical and financial support of the towns for his military prosecution in Poland and Naples, began to yield to these protectionist demands, granting municipal councils the authority to inspect Jewish warehouses and regulate their retail transactions. This shift in royal policy indicated that the Crown now prioritized the collective loyalty of the urban guilds over the individual fiscal utility of its Jewish chamber servants. Consequently, the guild's resentment provided the political momentum necessary to criminalize the traditional commercial practices of the community, framing their expertise as a predatory usurpation of Christian livelihood that required immediate legislative correction. The fiscal administration of Louis XIII was characterized by a transition from the transactional patronage of the early Anjou era to a system of predatory extraction designed to fund the kingdom's expansive military interventions. The monarch's persistent engagement in the Neapolitan Wars of Succession and his subsequent campaigns to secure the Polish throne required an immediate and continuous supply of bullion that the ordinary revenues of the royal domains were unable to provide. To bridge this structural deficit, the royal treasury intensified its reliance on the tallage, an arbitrary and comprehensive levy imposed on the Jewish community under their status as servi cameri. Unlike the standardized taxes applied to the Christian burgher or noble estates, the tallage was not governed by established legal precedents or fixed rates. It was an executive mandate based solely on the royal chamber's perception of the community's current liquid assets. This shift marked the point where the crown ceased to view its Jewish subjects as a productive economic class to be sustained for long-term utility, and instead categorized them as a liquid reservoir to be consumed for immediate geopolitical objectives. The mechanical execution of these levies was managed by the royal chamber in Buda, which utilized the centralized debt registers, the archae, to audit the total body of indebtedness held by Jewish financiers. By analyzing these records, royal auditors could calculate the maximum extractable wealth of a community before its operations reached a state of total collapse. During the high-intensity periods of the 1350s and 1360s, these tallages were imposed with such frequency that they exceeded the annual interest income of the lenders, forcing many families to liquidate their physical collateral, including silver plate, jewelry, and residential property, to meet the crown's demands. This process of systematic decapitalization was codified under the right of seizure, which permitted royal officials to enter the Jewish quarters of Bratislava and Trnava to sequester movable goods when cash payments were delayed. The state's fiscal policy thus moved from the protection of credit to the outright confiscation of the capital that underpinned it. Furthermore, Louis XIII introduced the practice of debt assignment, whereby the crown would satisfy its obligations to foreign mercenaries or high-ranking nobles by transferring the right to collect Jewish debts directly to these third parties. This administrative maneuver effectively bypassed the Jewish lender entirely, as the king would cancel the interest owed by a Christian debtor in exchange for a direct payment to the Royal Military Fund. This policy not only depleted the community's working capital, but also eroded the legal standing of their contracts, as the crown's sovereign need for war funding overrode the sanctity of private commercial agreements. The royal chancery increasingly viewed the total body of Jewish debt as a royal asset rather than private property, leading to a state of structural insolvency for many previously prominent financial houses. The administrative records of the late 14th century confirm that this predatory taxation served as a prerequisite for the eventual expulsion. By 1375, the relentless drain of capital had rendered the Jewish community increasingly incapable of fulfilling its traditional role as a source of state credit. The crown, having extracted the majority of the community's movable wealth to fund the acquisition of the Polish crown, began to view the impoverished residents as a political liability rather than a fiscal asset. The move from patronage to predation thus prepared the legal and economic ground for the 1380 decree. Once the liquid reservoir was sufficiently drained, the ideological goal of religious homogeneity could be pursued without the risk of significant financial loss to the royal treasury. The tallage of the crown therefore acted as the final stage of administrative processing, transforming the community from an indispensable financial partner into a disposable social element. The structural erosion of Jewish financial standing in Upper Hungary was significantly accelerated by the debt forgiveness petitions, a coordinated political offensive launched by the noble and burgher estates during the mid-14th century. As the military and administrative costs of the Anjou state intensified, the terrestrial nobility and the urban patriciate found themselves increasingly burdened by compounding interest on loans used to fund feudal levies and municipal infrastructure. These estates utilized the regional diets and the royal council as platforms to lobby the crown for the systematic cancellation of their liabilities, framing their private indebtedness as a collective threat to the kingdom's social order. The petitioners argued that the legal enforcement of interest-bearing contracts was a violation of the Christian commonweal, leveraging the moral weight of canon law against the secular protections historically afforded to Jewish creditors. This lobbying effort transformed the repayment of debt from a private civil obligation into a central political issue, forcing Louis XIV to choose between the fiscal utility of his chamber servants and the political loyalty of his Christian subjects. The mechanical instrument for this state-sanctioned default was the Letter of Grace, Litterae Gratiae, a royal decree that summarily annulled the interest or the entire principal of specific debts owed to Jewish lenders. The royal chancery increasingly utilized these mandates as a tool of political patronage, granting debt relief to influential barons and strategic mining towns in exchange for their support of the king's dynastic claims in Poland and Naples. This practice was formalized through the amortizatio, a legal procedure that permitted the crown to declaring Jewish-held bonds null and void without compensation to the lender. In the Slovakian counties, where the nobility relied heavily on Jewish capital to maintain their fortified estates, these petitions resulted in the wholesale destruction of regional credit networks. The 1351 renewal of the Golden Bull further incentivized this default by reinforcing the nobility's right to resist the exorbitant demands of non-Christian financiers, effectively providing a constitutional veneer to the expropriation of Jewish capital. The administrative consequence of these petitions was the total subversion of the Arca system's integrity. When the king issued a general decree of debt cancellation, royal officials were dispatched to the Jewish quarters to physically remove or destroy the bipartite indentures stored in the communal chests. This systematic erasure of documentation meant that the Jewish community lost the legal means to pursue their claims in the royal courts, as the sovereign will of the monarch now superseded the sanctity of notarized contracts. The documentation from the period shows a precipitous decline in the volume of new loans, as the Jewish mercantile elite recognized that the crown was no longer willing to enforce the security of their investments. This state-induced credit contraction decimated the capital reserves of the Kahal, reducing the community's ability to meet the king's own tallage demands. The success of the debt forgiveness movement demonstrated that the Jewish community had lost its strategic value as a fiscal intermediary. By 1378, the volume of petitions had shifted from requests for individual relief to demands for a universal clean slate, a policy that linked the total abolition of Jewish debt to the final religious purification of the realm. The royal court in Buda, having already extracted the majority of the community's movable wealth through predatory taxation, viewed the cancellation of the remaining debts as a cost-free concession to the restless estates. The debt forgiveness petitions thus functioned as the penultimate stage of the exclusionary process, stripping the Jewish residents of their last remaining economic leverage and finalizing their social marginalization. By the time the 1380 expulsion was enacted, the community was already legally and financially bankrupt, their contracts rendered worthless by the prior success of the estate's lobbying efforts. The mid-14th century religious transformation of the Slovakian royal cities was significantly accelerated by the Mendicant Offensive, a period of intense ecclesiastical mobilization characterized by the arrival and rapid expansion of the Order of Preachers, or Dominicans. Unlike the established Benedictine or Cistercian monasteries, which functioned as secluded agrarian landholders, the Dominicans were itinerant, urban-focused agents of the Holy See, who operated with the explicit patronage of the Anjou court. Louis XIV integrated these friars into the high tiers of the state's ideological apparatus, utilizing them as royal confessors and diplomatic emissaries to ensure that the Crown's policy of administrative centralization was mirrored by a program of rigorous theological homogenization. The mendicants established permanent convents in the strategic centers of Upper Hungary, including Bratislava, Trnava, and Košice, which served as operational hubs for the dissemination of a standardized anti-Jewish discourse that framed religious pluralism as a source of spiritual pollution, contaminatio, within the Christian commonweal. The primary mechanism of this offensive was the public sermon, a highly performative and persuasive tool that bypassed the traditional parish structure to reach the urban artisan and merchant classes. Dominican friars conducted these sermones ad status in the central marketplaces and city squares, utilizing a sophisticated rhetorical style that translated complex canon law concepts into a visceral language of social and religious exclusion. These sermons systematically portrayed the Jewish presence not as a fiscal necessity of the crown, but as a metaphysical threat to the integrity of the Catholic state. By interpreting the Great Schism and the various military setbacks of the era as divine punishment for the toleration of unbelief, the friars redirected local anxieties toward the Jewish quarters. This rhetorical shift was critical. It moved the discourse from the professional realm of financial regulation to the emotional realm of spiritual warfare, providing the theological justification for the dissolution of the king's peace that had historically protected the chamber servants. The Dominican offensive also focused on the systematic surveillance of interconfessional boundaries, particularly regarding the employment of Christian servants in Jewish households and the public visibility of non-Christian rituals. The friars lobbied municipal councils to enforce the Council of Vienne decrees, which demanded the strict residential and social segregation of the populations. This pressure resulted in the introduction of more frequent morality audits, where the mendicants assisted local magistrates in identifying and penalizing any social interaction that was deemed to undermine the authority of the Church. By mid-1370, the friars had successfully established a climate of intolerance that linked the spiritual health of the city to the total removal of the alien element. The institutional influence of the mendicants extended to the royal chancellery, where they successfully campaigned for the revocation of the judicial immunities provided by the Charter of 1251. They argued that the specialized legal status of the Jewish community was an unholy exception that prevented the implementation of a truly unified Christian order. This ecclesiastical pressure provided Louis XIII with the moral permission to sacrifice his financial agents in favor of a higher religious objective. The mendicant offensive therefore functioned as the necessary ideological prerequisite for the 1380 expulsion, as it prepared the urban populace to view the mass displacement not as a fiscal disruption, but as a necessary and righteous act of spiritual purification. By the time the decree was issued, the friars had effectively dismantled the centuries-old cultural and legal bridge between the communities, leaving the Jewish residents in a state of total social isolation. The legislative pressure on the Jewish communities of the Slovakian royal cities was codified through the provincial synods of the 14th century, which functioned as the primary ecclesiastical mechanism for aligning Hungarian state policy with the restrictive requirements of Roman canon law. These councils, convened by the archbishops of Esztergom and Kalocsa, sought to institutionalize the decrees of the Fourth Lateran Council and the Council of Vienne within the administrative framework of the Hungarian kingdom. While the secular crown had historically prioritized the fiscal utility of the servi camerae, the synods of the 1340s and 1350s introduced a series of statutory mandates designed to establish an irreversible social and physical distance between the Christian majority and the Jewish minority. The administrative logic of these councils was based on the doctrine of perpetual servitude, which held that the legal standing of non-Christians must be visibly and permanently subordinated to the authority of the Church to prevent the perceived degradation of the Catholic faith. A central outcome of these synods was the mandated enforcement of the distinguishing mark, typically a yellow ring or patch of cloth known as the signum, to be worn on the outer garment of all Jewish residents over the age of 7. Historical records from the Slovakian counties indicate that the bishops utilized the Edict of Recognition to transform religious difference into a constant public marker of social exclusion. This requirement was not merely symbolic, it functioned as a surveillance tool that allowed municipal guards and ecclesiastical inspectors to monitor interconfessional interactions in the marketplaces and public squares. The synodal decrees stipulated that the failure to display the mark would result in immediate corporal punishment or the confiscation of the individual's movable goods, effectively criminalizing anonymity. By the mid-1360s, the provincial councils had successfully pressured Louis XIII to incorporate these requirements into the royal statutes, thereby revoking the earlier Arpadian protections that had permitted Jewish merchants to move through the kingdom without such identifying markers. The synods also introduced a rigorous program of residential and social segregation, mandating the strict enforcement of the claustrum, or gated enclave. The ecclesiastical statutes prohibited Christians from sharing common infrastructure with Jewish residents, specifically targeting the use of public bathhouses, taverns, and communal ovens. Statutory measures were enacted to forbid the employment of Christian wet nurses and domestic servants in Jewish households, an act framed in the synodal registers as a necessary defense against the insidious influence of non-Christian rituals. In the mining towns of the north, these regulations were utilized to justify the physical relocation of Jewish families away from the central parish churches, ensuring that their religious observances remained invisible and contained within the ghetto walls. The synods mandated that synagogues must be lower in height than the surrounding Christian churches and lacked external ornamentation, an architectural restriction designed to reflect the community's theological subordination. Furthermore, the ecclesiastical councils utilized the threat of interdict to coerce municipal officials into enforcing these segregationist laws. The synodal records show that city councils in Bratislava and Trnava were warned that failure to police the boundaries of the Jewish quarter would result in the suspension of liturgical services for the entire town. This institutional blackmail forced local magistrates to prioritize religious compliance over the pragmatic economic benefits of interconfessional trade. The synods of the 14th century thus completed the legal wall-building process, transforming the Jewish population into a marked and isolated caste. By the time the 1380 expulsion was initiated, the provincial councils had established a comprehensive jurisdictional framework that defined the Jewish presence as a legal anomaly, providing the necessary constitutional foundation for the final administrative removal of the community from the realm. The inheritance of the Polish throne by Louis I in 1370, following the death of his uncle Casimir III, created a personal union that fundamentally expanded the administrative scope of the Anjou dynasty and necessitated a synchronization of domestic policies across a vast Central European axis. This geopolitical expansion brought the Hungarian and Polish crowns under a single executive authority, requiring the royal chancellery in Buda to harmonize the diverse legal frameworks of the two kingdoms into a unified imperial logic. Prior to 1370, the Polish state under the Piast dynasty had maintained a relatively pluralistic approach to its Jewish population, governed by the expansive protections of the Statute of Cales. However, the accession of Louis III introduced a more rigid Neapolitan-influenced clericalism to the Polish administration, effectively terminating the era of localized Piast patronage. The administrative alignment of the dual kingdoms prioritized the creation of a religiously uniform body politic, as the king utilized his expanded sovereignty to implement a transnational program of social and religious containment that linked the fate of the Jewish communities in the Slovakian counties to those in Little Poland. The Polish connection resulted in the systematic export of Hungarian exclusionary measures to the northern territories, while simultaneously importing Polish noble grievances into the Hungarian Royal Council. Under the regency of the king's mother, Elizabeth of Poland, the administration of the two realms was coordinated to ensure that the Jewish question was addressed with administrative consistency. This period saw the formal alignment of the Tricesima customs systems and the bullion monopolies, which were increasingly transitioned away from Jewish leaseholders in both Krakow and Bratislava. The royal chancellery utilized the 1374 privilege of Košice, a landmark constitutional agreement with the Polish nobility, to consolidate noble support by promising a retreat from the alien fiscal management strategies that had defined the previous decade. This political negotiation established a precedent where the king was willing to sacrifice the judicial immunities of his Jewish chamber servants to secure the recognition of his daughter's succession rights in both kingdoms. Poland turned out to be the most welcoming and supportive to the Jewish community in all medieval Europe. The synchronization of the two administrations also focused on the closure of the Silesian-Slovakian trade corridor to non-Christian merchants. The royal officials in the northern Hungarian counties were instructed to coordinate with the starostas of Little Poland to enforce a unified passport regime that effectively criminalized the mobility of Jewish itinerant traders between the two realms. This policy was intended to bankrupt the transnational credit networks that had historically linked the Danubian markets to the Baltic trade routes. By 1378, the royal chancellery had succeeded in creating a closed confessional zone that stretched from the Adriatic to the Vistula, where the presence of Jewish financiers was no longer protected by regional exceptions. The Polish connection thus provided Louis I with the geopolitical weight necessary to pursue a totalizing policy of religious purification. The administrative alignment of 1370 ensured that when the 1380 expulsion was eventually enacted, it was not merely a localized Slovakian or Hungarian event, but part of a broader, synchronized effort to purge the Anjou domains of those deemed incompatible with the king's vision of a unified Catholic empire. The transformation of socio-economic friction into an existential threat was catalyzed by the dissemination of the ritual mythos, a complex of supernatural accusations that redefined the Jewish presence in Upper Hungary. This period saw the migration of Western European blood libel narratives, the claim that Jewish communities required the blood of Christian children for ritual purposes, into the Danubian and Carpathian urban centers. These accusations functioned as a powerful tool of social mobilization, providing a visceral moral justification for the increasing resentment of the artisan and merchant classes. Administrative records from the 14th century indicate that these localized panics were rarely spontaneous. Instead, they were often preceded by periods of high indebtedness or disputes over municipal trade monopolies. The ritual mythos allowed for the transmutation of mundane financial grievances into a perceived cosmic struggle between the Christian commonweal and an alleged hidden malevolence. Central to this mythos was the accusation of host desecration, the belief that Jewish residents sought to obtain and torture the consecrated bread of the Eucharist to reenact the Passion of Christ. In the Slovakian royal free cities, these allegations were systematically investigated by ecclesiastical courts, often utilizing the testimony of converted or coerced witnesses to validate the narrative. The institutionalization of these myths by the clergy provided them with an aura of legal fact, allowing for the suspension of the traditional judicial protections provided by the crown. When a ritual accusation was leveled, the king's peace was frequently superseded by the state of exception, where the normal rules of evidence were replaced by the logic of inquisitorial necessity. This shift undermined the fiscal stability of the Kahal, as communal resources were increasingly diverted toward the payment of exorbitant peace fines or the defense of individuals accused of capital religious crimes. The spread of these accusations coincided with the professionalization of the royal chancery under Louis XIV, which increasingly favored the use of written evidence and moral character as prerequisites for legal standing. The ritual mythos functioned as an ontological disqualifier. If the Jewish subject was perceived as a ritual predator, their status as a protected chamber servant became logically and politically indefensible. This era saw the emergence of localized cults centered around martyred children, whose shrines served as permanent physical reminders of the alleged Jewish threat. These sites functioned as psychological anchors for the urban populace, ensuring that the ritual mythos remained a constant element of the collective memory and municipal identity. Furthermore, the Crown utilized the threat of ritual murder investigations as a tool of fiscal leverage. By threatening to launch a full-scale inquiry into a community's religious practices, the monarch could extract voluntary gifts or the cancellation of royal debts. This strategic use of the ritual mythos signaled the final collapse of the transactional relationship between the sovereign and the community. By 1380, the accumulation of these localized panics had created a social environment where the total removal of the Jewish population was seen not as a loss of revenue, but as a necessary act of public safety and religious purification. The mythos had successfully redefined the Jewish resident from a fiscal asset into a terminal danger, ensuring that the upcoming decree of expulsion would be met with widespread popular approval. The socio-political landscape of the 1380 expulsion was profoundly shaped by the Black Death echoes, the enduring psychological and legal trauma of the bubonic plague that decimated Europe between 1348 and 1350. Although historical epidemiological data suggests that the Kingdom of Hungary, and specifically the Upper Hungarian Highlands, experienced a lower mortality rate than the Mediterranean or Germanic lands, the administrative response to the pandemic introduced a new, lethal category of accusation, the poisoner narrative. This discourse alleged that the Jewish community had initiated the contagion by systematically contaminating the communal wells and riverine sources of the royal free cities with manufactured toxins. Unlike the theological nature of the ritual murder myth, the poisoner narrative was framed as a matter of public health and state security, transforming the Jewish resident from a religious dissident into a biological threat to the survival of the Christian populace. Even as the immediate mortality of the mid-century subsided, this poisoning allegation remained dormant within the municipal statutes of towns like Bratislava and Trnava, ready to be reactivated during periods of subsequent social or economic stress. The institutionalization of this narrative was facilitated by the Edict of Public Safety, a series of emergency municipal ordinances enacted during the plague years that remained in force for decades. These regulations mandated the strict surveillance of all water sources located near the Jewish quarters and authorized municipal guards to conduct arbitrary searches of Jewish households for suspect substances. In the Slovakian mining districts, where the quality of the water supply was critical for both human consumption and ore processing, these suspicions were particularly acute. The royal chancery despite its earlier role as a protector of the chamber servants, failed to issue a definitive refutation of the poisoning myth. While Pope Clement VI had issued the bull Sicut Judaeus in 1348, arguing that Jews were dying of the plague in equal numbers and thus could not be its architects, the local Hungarian clergy and the Anjou court largely ignored this defense. Instead, the poisoner label was utilized as a tool for the biological segregation of the community, providing a secular, state-sponsored justification for the closure of the Jewish quarters during subsequent smaller outbreaks of disease in the 1360s and 1370s. The Black Death echoes also resulted in the permanent criminalization of Jewish medical and pharmaceutical expertise. Prior to the mid-14th century, Jewish physicians had frequently served at the royal court and in noble households. However, the post-plague environment saw the introduction of statutes that prohibited non-Christian practitioners from treating Christian patients or preparing medicinal compounds. The municipal councils argued that any knowledge of healing was inextricably linked to a knowledge of poisoning, making the Jewish doctor a figure of inherent suspicion. This professional exclusion stripped the community of one of its most prestigious and lucrative social roles, further narrowing their economic base to the increasingly volatile field of high-risk credit. By 1380, the poisoner narrative had evolved from a frantic reaction to a plague crisis into a settled administrative fact. It provided the final scientific layer to the case for expulsion. If the Jewish presence was fundamentally toxic to the physical well-being of the kingdom, then their removal was an act of cleansing, mundatio, rather than a simple migration. The social trauma of the Black Death thus provided the 1380 decree with a sense of retroactive justice, allowing the crown to frame the mass displacement as the fulfillment of a long-delayed mandate for public health. The echoes of the plague ensured that when the order to depart was eventually issued, it was framed not as a fiscal reorganization, but as the final eradication of a persistent and invisible danger to the life of the realm. The final legislative phase of the exclusionary process was enacted in 1380 during the secret deliberations of the royal diet, where the transactional relationship between the Anjou crown and the Jewish community was formally terminated. This session was characterized by a convergence of high-level clerical lobbying and the king's desire to secure a legacy of total religious uniformity before the end of his reign. The deliberations moved beyond the traditional negotiation of fiscal tallages and instead focused on the theological purification of the state, a concept that had migrated from the mendicant pulpit to the center of royal policy. Historical evidence indicates that the decision-making process was confined to a narrow circle of the Concilium Regium, comprising the king, the Archbishop of Esztergom, and a select group of Neapolitan-trained jurists who viewed the Jewish presence as a terminal impediment to the Holy Hungarian Kingdom. Unlike the public diets, where economic grievances were typically debated, these secret sessions prioritized the unification of the faith as a prerequisite for the stable succession of Louis I's daughters, Maria and Hedwig. The king utilized the expulsion as a form of political currency, offering the total removal of the Jewish population to the noble estates and the high clergy in exchange for their formal recognition of his dynastic plans. The administrative records of the royal chancery suggest that by 1380, a definitive cost-benefit analysis had been completed. The prior systematic decapitalization of the Jewish quarters through predatory taxation and the cancellation of debts had rendered the community fiscally redundant. The treasury officials in Buda confirmed that the revenue derived from the servi camerae could no longer offset the political and spiritual costs associated with their continued presence. The 1380 deliberations resulted in the formulation of a final decretum, which categorized the Jewish population as an irreconcilable element that could no longer be integrated into the state's centralized bureaucracy. The secret nature of these meetings was a tactical necessity intended to prevent the liquidation of remaining communal assets or the mass flight of residents before the royal machinery was positioned to seize their immovable property. The high clergy argued that the previous centuries of protective patronage had been a spiritual error that required immediate legislative correction to restore divine favor to the realm. The Diet thus functioned not as a deliberative body, but as the administrative venue for the formalization of a pre-existing ideological mandate. This period of secret legislation marked the definitive end of the iura regalia that had protected the Jewish residents since the Arpadian era. The royal chancery prepared the language of the final decree, which shifted the justification for exclusion from the previous localized accusations of the 1360s to a global state-mandated program of religious cleansing. By the conclusion of the 1380 Diet, the legal status of the Jewish community had been reduced to that of a proscribed class with no remaining avenues for judicial appeal or royal dispensation. The decision at the Diet served as the final administrative trigger, transforming decades of socio-economic pressure into a singular, irreversible act of state power. The secrecy of the process ensured that the community remained unaware of the impending order until the administrative preparations for the mass displacement were fully complete, leaving them without the means to contest the total dissolution of their legal existence. The formal issuance of the royal proclamation in 1380 marked the definitive transition of the exclusionary policy from secret administrative deliberation to public enforceable law. Following the conclusion of the Royal Diet, the Hungarian Chancery in Buda produced the official decretum, a document that functioned as the final legislative instrument for the removal of all non-baptized residents from the kingdom. This mandate was not a regional ordinance, but a comprehensive sovereign act, signed by Louis I and validated by the Great Seal of the realm, signifying the total withdrawal of royal patronage. The text of the proclamation established a rigid theological binary. The only legal avenue for remaining within the borders of Hungary was the public acceptance of Christian baptism. For those who maintained their ancestral faith, the decree provided a singular, non-negotiable directive: the immediate and permanent departure from the king's domains. The mechanical dissemination of this proclamation was managed through the kingdom's hierarchical administrative network, beginning with the transmission of copies to the comes of the northern counties and the municipal magistrates of the royal free cities. In centers such as Bratislava, Trnava, and Nitra, the arrival of the royal messenger signaled the suspension of all normal civic activities. The decree was publicly read by town criers in the marketplaces and at the gates of the Jewish quarters, a procedure intended to ensure that the mandate reached every level of the urban and rural populace. This public reading functioned as the legal death of the Jewish community's status as servi camerae. By making the expulsion a matter of public record, the Crown effectively invited the Christian burghers and noble estates to view the Jewish population as outlaws. The administrative language of the proclamation specifically identified the presence of non-baptized persons as a spiritual contagion that threatened the stability of the Anjou state, thereby criminalizing the very existence of the community. The 1380 mandate also included specific instructions for the municipal councils regarding the surveillance of the Jewish residents during the transition period. The royal chancery demanded that city officials prevent the unauthorized transport of bullion or the hiding of communal archives, requiring that all Jewish households be kept under continuous monitoring. The proclamation established that any resident found within the kingdom after the deadline without proof of baptism would be subject to the forfeiture of their life and the total confiscation of their property by the royal treasury. This clause ensured that baptism was not merely a spiritual option, but a desperate legal maneuver for those seeking to preserve their physical and economic survival. The state utilized this pressure to maximize the number of forced conversions, viewing each baptism as a successful step toward the total religious homogenization of the realm. Furthermore, the proclamation formally rescinded all previous royal charters, including the foundational protections of 1251. By explicitly declaring all prior privileges null and void, the 1380 decree stripped the community of its judicial autonomy and its right to royal protection. The document confirmed that the king's grace had been withdrawn, leaving the residents without a protector in a society that had been systematically primed for their departure. The issuance of the proclamation thus completed the legislative encirclement of the community, transforming centuries of sedentary life into a prescribed state of transit. By the time the final echoes of the town crier's voice faded in the streets of the Slovakian towns, the legal and social framework that had permitted Jewish life in the Carpathian Basin had been thoroughly and irreversibly dismantled. The execution of the 1380 expulsion was governed by the 3-month ultimatum, a rigid temporal constraint that functioned as the final administrative phase of the Jewish presence in the Slovakian royal cities. This 90-day window was not a period of grace, but a strategic interval designed to ensure the orderly liquidation of the community's remaining economic assets and the systematic settlement of all outstanding obligations to the royal fiscus. The Hungarian Chancery utilized this deadline to synchronize the mass displacement with the fiscal calendar of the royal chamber, allowing for a final, comprehensive audit of the community's liabilities before their legal status was permanently extinguished. In centers such as Bratislava and Trnava, the commencement of this ultimatum triggered the immediate suspension of all new commercial contracts and the freezing of credit operations, as the state sought to prevent the capital flight of bullion and movable wealth across the frontiers of Austria and Poland. A primary requirement of the ultimatum was the final tallage settlement, a mandate that required every Jewish household to clear all arrears related to the lucrum camera and previous extraordinary war taxes. The royal auditors in Buddha stipulated that no individual would be granted a safe conduct pass, literae salvi conductus, until they provided documented proof from the royal treasurer that their state-mandated contributions were paid in full. This requirement effectively turned the departure process into a final act of state extraction. The Crown ensured that it received the total projected revenue from its chamber servants before they were discarded. For the many families whose working capital had already been depleted by previous predatory taxation, this final demand necessitated the immediate, desperate sale of personal effects and ritual items to meet the king's price for departure. The administrative burden of managing the ultimatum was placed on the Kahal leadership, who were held collectively responsible for the community's adherence to the timeline. The Board of Elders was tasked with the consolidation of debts, a process where the community was forced to settle or sell its outstanding loan bonds to Christian burghers and noble estates at a massive discount. Because the 3-month deadline created a buyer's market, the Jewish lenders were forced to accept as little as 10 to 20% of the principal value of their contracts. The state facilitated this transfer of wealth by appointing royal commissioners to oversee the liquidation courts, ensuring that the Christian majority could acquire the community's credit portfolios with minimal expenditure. This process ensured that the local economy would not collapse upon the community's departure, as the financial instruments they had created were transferred into the hands of the newly empowered Christian merchant class. Furthermore, the ultimatum established the inventory of exit, a ledger-keeping process where every departing resident was required to register their remaining movable goods with the municipal magistrates. The royal decree prohibited the transport of any quantities of gold or silver that exceeded a minimal personal allowance, effectively mandating that the bulk of the community's refined metal remain within the kingdom's borders. Those found attempting to conceal bullion or transport uninventoried assets after the expiration of the 90-day window were subject to immediate imprisonment and the total forfeiture of their goods to the crown. By the final weeks of the ultimatum, the Jewish quarters had been transformed into zones of intense administrative processing, where the residents were systematically stripped of their remaining economic leverage. The 3-month ultimatum thus functioned as the final tool of state-managed decapitalization, ensuring that the community left behind the maximum possible value to the treasury and the estates, while being reduced to a state of total financial powerlessness. The final administrative phase of the 1380 expulsion was the liquidation of stone, a process characterized by the forced transfer of immovable property from Jewish ownership to the Christian municipal and ecclesiastical estates. Unlike movable goods, which could be inventoried or concealed, the stone houses, warehouses, and synagogues of the Jewish quarters represented a fixed and highly visible form of wealth that the royal treasury and the municipal councils sought to internalize within the new uniform Christian urban fabric. The 3-month ultimatum, established by the royal chancery, created an artificial collapse in real estate values, as the Jewish residents were legally prohibited from retaining title to their lands after the departure deadline. This temporal pressure turned the disposal of bona immobilia into a state-managed fire sale, where the Christian burgher class, organized through their guilds, utilized the right of preemption to acquire prime urban real estate at a fraction of its documented construction and market value. Historical records from Bratislava and Trnava indicate that the Jewish quarters often contained the most durable and prestigious architecture in the city, with many residents occupying domus lapidei, formidable stone dwellings that featured deep vaulted cellars designed for the secure storage of bullion and trade commodities. The municipal councils coordinated the Commission of Appraisal, a body composed of Christian artisans and royal tax officials, to determine the just price for these properties. In practice, these appraisals ignored the speculative value of the sites, focusing instead on the base value of the materials, which allowed local Christian merchants to purchase multi-story stone residences for the price of simple timber cottages. The royal chamber sanctioned this expropriation because it effectively settled the political debts the crown owed to the urban patriciate in exchange for their support of the Anjou centralization program. The liquidation of institutional property, specifically the synagogues and communal halls, was managed through a different legal mechanism known as the religious reversion. Because these buildings had been constructed under royal charters that were now rescinded, the crown treated them as ownerless assets that reverted to the sovereign's direct control. These structures were rarely demolished. Instead, they were systematically repurposed to serve the ideological goals of the state. Synagogues in the northern counties were frequently converted into parish chapels, hospitals, or royal warehouses, a transformation that physically manifested the triumph of Catholic uniformity over the previous pluralistic order. The archival registers of the period show that the interior ritual objects were often sequestered by the local bishops, while the exterior stone shells were stripped of any Hebrew inscriptions or distinguishing features to erase the memory of their original function. Furthermore, the cemeteries were reclassified as generic crown property, often resulting in their eventual lease as grazing land or their conversion into building sites for new municipal infrastructure. The liquidation of stone thus served a dual purpose. It provided an immediate economic windfall for the Christian urban estates, while simultaneously achieving the total cultural erasure of the Jewish presence. By 1380, the physical Jewish street had been thoroughly absorbed into the municipal geography, its stone infrastructure providing the foundation for the next century of Christian commercial expansion. This systematic transfer of title ensured that the departing exiles left behind no physical anchor in the Slovakian towns, finalizing their transition from sedentary subjects of the king to landless migrants in the neighboring territories. The end of the liquidation process marked the completion of the demographic and architectural cleansing of the royal free cities, leaving a landscape that was legally, religiously, and physically homogeneous. The physical removal of the Jewish population from the Slovakian royal cities was executed through the mobilization of the banderia, the regional military regiments maintained by the county, comes, and the high nobility. Following the expiration of the 3-month ultimatum, the royal chancellery transitioned from administrative processing to military enforcement, utilizing the state's armed apparatus to ensure the total clearance of the urban centers. This process was coordinated by the capitaneas of the northern districts, who established a systematic cordon around the Jewish quarters to prevent any unauthorized evasion of the decree or the scattering of residents into the rural feudal estates. The military's primary objective was the formation of structured convoys, grouping households into manageable units for the march toward the frontiers of the Archduchy of Austria and the Kingdom of Poland. This mobilization represented the final application of the Servi Camerai doctrine. The crown exercised its ultimate right over the bodies of its subjects by physically displacing them beyond the jurisdictional limits of the realm. The logistics of the expulsion were dictated by the border gate system, with the majority of the Bratislava and Trnava communities being funneled toward the western frontier along the Morava River. The royal escort provided each convoy with literae salvi conductus, or safe conduct letters, which were essential for navigating the internal tolls and checkpoints maintained by the local barony. These documents did not grant the exiles any rights, but functioned as military orders to the local castellans, demanding that the convoys be permitted to pass without the interference of localized noble predation. The crown's concern was not the welfare of the displaced, but the preservation of internal order and the prevention of any spontaneous violence that might disrupt the transit routes or the collection of the final departure duties. The escort was, in effect, a moving jurisdictional boundary, ensuring that the exiles remained under royal oversight until the exact moment they crossed the limes, the legal threshold of the kingdom. For the communities of the eastern and central mining districts, the displacement route led northward through the mountain passes toward Silesia and the Polish territories of Little Poland. These marches were overseen by the Royal Bandarium of the Spish and Sharish counties, which coordinated the transit with the Polish starostas on the other side of the frontier. Historical evidence suggests that the state utilized the compulsory route protocol, prohibiting the convoys from entering any towns or villages not explicitly designated on their transit maps. This isolation was intended to prevent the exiles from establishing temporary residencies or attempting to trade remaining movable assets with the rural populace. The cost of the military escort was frequently deducted from the final communal funds of the Kahal, making the community pay for the very machinery that was removing them. The final phase of the cordon was the handover at the boundary, a formal procedure where the Hungarian royal officers presented the safe conduct registers to the frontier guards of the neighboring states. At this point, the legal link between the Anjou crown and the Jewish residents was permanently severed. Once across the border, the exiles became stateless entities no longer protected by the Hungarian king's peace. The military units then returned to the royal cities to conduct the final sweeping of the quarters, ensuring that no non-baptized individual remained in hiding within the cellars or vaults. This military operation finalized the demographic transition of the Slovakian towns, transforming the cordon of the border into an impenetrable barrier that prohibited any legal return. By the end of 1380, the royal troops had completed the physical dissolution of the community, leaving the frontier zones as the final markers of a centuries-long residence that had been systematically erased by the state's military and administrative will. The physical departure of the Jewish financial elite in late 1380 precipitated an immediate and systemic contraction of the Upper Hungarian economy, characterized by the abrupt cessation of the high-velocity credit circulation that had underpinned the late Anjou state. In the Danubian hub of Bratislava, the previous fluidity of the international exchange markets was replaced by a period of structural inertia as the primary agents of the cambium, the currency exchange, were no longer present to facilitate the valuation of foreign bullion. The municipal archives from the subsequent decade record a precipitous decline in the volume of wholesale transactions as the Christian merchant guilds, despite having successfully lobbied for the removal of their competitors, lacked the private liquid reserves necessary to sustain the trans-European trade routes. This silence of the marketplace was a documented fiscal reality, evidenced by the sharp reduction in the tricesima customs duties collected at the riverine ports, where the movement of luxury textiles and industrial materials effectively stalled without the Jewish intermediaries who had managed the logistics of transit. The impact was particularly acute in the royal mining towns of the Ore Mountains, where the complex infrastructure of precious metal extraction was inextricably linked to Jewish capital investment. The removal of Jewish bullion brokers and administrative specialists led to a localized industrial crisis in centers like Kremnica and Banska Štiavnica, as the supply chains for essential refining materials, such as mercury and lead, were severed. Historical data from the royal chamber indicates that without the Jewish arrendators to absorb the high upfront costs of deep shaft mining, many mining operations reverted to primitive surface extraction, resulting in a significant decrease in the output of the royal mints. The Kannahai, newly empowered Christian mining entrepreneurs, struggled to replicate the sophisticated risk management and accounting strategies required to navigate the volatile silver markets of Central Europe. This technical and financial vacuum slowed the pace of technological innovation in the highlands, leading to a multi-year stagnation in ore production that threatened the integrity of the Hungarian gold florin. Furthermore, the provincial nobility, who had benefited from the royal decrees of debt cancellation, found themselves in a state of unintended economic isolation. While their immediate liabilities were erased, the total destruction of the Jewish credit infrastructure meant they could no longer secure the short-term financing required to maintain their manorial estates or meet their feudal military obligations. The clean slate of 1380 effectively dismantled the regional capital market, forcing the nobility to rely on less efficient land-based barter or the predatory terms of foreign banking firms that operated with significantly higher interest rates. This credit freeze hindered the development of rural infrastructure, as the funds previously available for mill construction and agricultural improvement disappeared with the lenders. The royal treasury also experienced a profound budgetary shock. The loss of the predictable, non-agrarian revenue derived from Jewish tallages forced the crown to impose increasingly unpopular taxes on the Christian burghers and the peasantry. This fiscal shift generated the very socio-economic friction the expulsion was intended to resolve, as the state sought to fill the vacuum left by its former chamber servants. By 1385, the economic topography of the Slovakian districts had been reshaped into a more localized and rigid system, where the absence of a professional credit class functioned as a permanent ceiling on the kingdom's commercial potential. The silence of the marketplace, thus served as the final measurable consequence of the 1380 decree, proving that the ideological goal of religious uniformity had been achieved at the cost of the kingdom's structural economic vitality. The administrative finality of the 1380 expulsion was manifested in the immediate conversion of space, a state-mandated process that systematically erased the Jewish functional identity of the urban landscape. Upon the departure of the last convoys, the royal chancellery invoked the principle of fiscus post possessionum, asserting that all vacated institutional buildings reverted to the crown as ownerless assets. This transition was characterized by the rapid sacral appropriation of synagogues, which were viewed by the ecclesiastical authorities not merely as vacant property, but as sites requiring spiritual purification and structural reorientation. In cities like Bratislava and Trnava, the local bishops oversaw the consecratio of these stone structures, transforming former houses of Hebrew liturgy into Catholic parish chapels. This process involved the physical removal of the Aron Kodesh and the Bima, which were replaced by consecrated altars and crucifixes, effectively integrating the highest quality Jewish architecture into the kingdom's devotional network. These repurposed buildings were frequently dedicated to saints associated with the victory of the faith, serving as permanent architectural trophies of the Anjou program of religious uniformity. Simultaneously, the secular infrastructure of the community, including the Kahal administrative offices, ritual baths, and communal hospitals, was subjected to a program of secular utilitarianism. The royal chamber recognized that these central urban structures possessed significant logistical value due to their durable stone construction and proximity to the municipal markets. Consequently, many communal halls were immediately converted into horea regia, or royal granaries, while others were utilized as secure warehouses for the storage of the king's salt and bullion monopolies. The mikvayot, or ritual baths, were often filled or repurposed as subterranean cellarage for the storage of wine and perishable commodities, a transition that utilized their specialized water management systems for purely commercial ends. This repurposing ensured that the Crown and the municipal councils derived immediate utility from the expulsion, turning the vacated Jewish street into a primary logistical hub for the newly expanded Christian merchant guilds. The architectural erasure also extended to the exterior facades of the Jewish quarters, where royal stonemasons were commissioned to remove all Hebrew epigraphy and ritual symbols. The physical removal of these markers was an essential component of the monopoly of memory sought by the Anjou state. By stripping the buildings of their original identity, the royal administration intended to make the Jewish residence appear as a temporary, long-ended anomaly, rather than a centuries-old tradition. The Abba stone fragments from demolished ritual sites were often recycled into the construction of new municipal fortifications or church foundations, a practice that literally embedded the remnants of the community into the physical defenses of the Catholic state. This systematic recycling of materials reduced the community's existence to a set of anonymous building blocks, facilitating the rapid integration of the ghetto into the broader town layout. The conversion of these spaces was documented in the royal rationes, where the officials of the treasury recorded the new state-sanctioned functions of each property. By 1382, the previously distinct topography of the Jewish quarter had been completely absorbed into the municipal administrative grid, with former institutional buildings functioning as customs houses or guild meeting halls. The conversion of space thus provided the final visual proof of the 1380 decree's success. It ensured that even if the legal ban were eventually lifted, the community would find no physical infrastructure to return to, as their spiritual and administrative centers had been permanently claimed by the Church and the Crown. This architectural transformation finalized the demographic cleansing of the Slovakian towns, leaving behind a landscape where the only evidence of the former residents was the high-quality stone they had once commissioned, now serving the interests of the sovereign who had displaced them. The crossing of the Morava and Vistula rivers in late 1380 marked the final jurisdictional transition of the community from the servi camerai of the Anjou crown to the localized and varying legal regimes of the Austrian dukes and the Polish starostas. This migration was not merely a physical displacement, but a systemic reclassification within the broader European legal landscape, where the exiles were forced to integrate into established frameworks that were often less protective than the earlier Arpadian codes. In the Polish territories, the displaced residents from the Slovakian districts were subsumed into the existing population under the General Charter of Jewish Liberties. Yet they faced immediate social and economic pressures as newcomers in the crowded urban centers of Little Poland and Silesia. The administrative continuity that had defined their existence in the Carpathian Basin for centuries was severed, replaced by a fragmented status that required the constant renegotiation of residency rights with municipal councils. This period of resettlement was characterized by a geographic dispersion that dismantled the formerly cohesive Hungarian Kahal structures, as families were spread across a wide range of territories to avoid exhausting the fiscal carrying capacity of any single host city. The decades following the 1380 decree are defined in the Hungarian and Slovakian state archives by a definitive legal silence, a period where the previously voluminous references to Jewish tax, assessments, debt registers, and judicial disputes entirely vanish from the royal rationes. This archival void is the most measurable evidence of the total success of the Anjou program of administrative erasure. The royal chancellery in Buda ceased to maintain specialized departments for the management of non-Christian capital, and the previously vital office of the Jewish judge was abolished as an obsolete bureau. For nearly 40 years, the judicial records of the northern counties contain no documentation of interconfessional litigation or property transfers involving Jewish parties, signifying that the community had ceased to exist as a legally recognized entity within the realm. This era of invisibility meant that the sophisticated financial and metallurgical machinery of the 1360s was entirely dismantled, leaving a generational gap in the professional and genealogical records of the region. While the vast majority of the population entered the migrant stream, a marginal demographic persisted through the mechanism of tactical or forced baptism. These conversos were absorbed into the Christian artisan guilds, where they were subjected to the morality audits of the mendicant orders to ensure their total religious conformity. However, these individuals were no longer tracked as a distinct administrative group, and their specific economic contributions were subsumed into the broader municipal history of the towns. The center of gravity for the Central European Ashkenazi population shifted permanently toward the north and east, leaving the Slovakian highlands as a demographic vacuum for non-Catholic residents. The diaspora of memory thus refers to the loss of the physical and documented anchor that had sustained the community's identity. By the turn of the 15th century, the memory of the Jewish presence in the royal free cities had been reduced to a set of obsolete legal references in the old Arpadian codes, marking the end of the first great cycle of Jewish life in the territory. The 1380 expulsion achieved a multi-generational hiatus in the cultural and economic history of the northern frontier, ensuring that the return of Jewish residents under the reign of Sigismund of Luxembourg would occur under an entirely different and more restricted set of legal and social conditions.